In this video, we're going to learn how to use the jQuery UI to create sliders. Sliders are used to input a numeric value using a handle that we can move with the mouse, or even using the arrow keys. Okay, so let's create our first slider. So we're gonna need to create a div that we will so we give it an ID. Let's call it slider. Okay, and we can access this element using its ID, which is slider, and then we're gonna use a method called slider. It's straightforward. Okay, so if we refresh the page, we can see that we've got a slider there, so we can use the handle and move it using the mouse. Also, we can move it using the arrow keys. Okay, so now let's create a label for our slider. So we're gonna add a label. We're gonna use the for property is for slider. Okay, so let's put some text for the label. So value. Okay, and now we're gonna have the value of the numeric value next to the label. So a way to do that is to have an input in here, and once we start sliding, every time we slide, we can change the value of this input depending on the position of the handle. All right, so let's create our input. It's going to be text, and also let's give it an ID that we're going to need in the code. All right, this input is going to be read-only. We don't allow the user to input anything there. There is a property that we need for that. It's read-only. Okay, so if you specify, or if you add this keyword into to an input tag, this means that the user will not be allowed to input any value in there. Okay, and we're going to use code to affect any values to this input. We can style it as well, so let's have some styling there for these inputs. So let's go for a color. Okay, I'm gonna go for blue like that, and we're gonna take out the border as well. Okay, and also let's have a font weight bold. Now we're gonna add a property to our slider, because we want the this input to change depending on the position of the handle. So the property we're gonna use is gonna be slide, and what we need to write here is a function that we are going to execute every time we move the handle. So we're going to define a function, but this time this function is going to have parameters, the event and UI objects. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to access our input using its ID, and we will set the value of this input to the value of our slider. Okay, so at the moment the slider doesn't have any min value or max value, so it doesn't make sense at the moment to affect any value or expect the slider to have any value there. But let's just go for that for now. Let's just set the value to UI.value. So UI.value refers to the value of the slider. Okay, so if we do this, let's see what's going to happen. So if we move the handle, by default, the min value is 0 and the max value is 100. Okay, we can change that if we want to. So we can set the min value and max value by adding other properties. So the min is gonna give us the minimum value, and the max is gonna give the max value. So we can go for 0 for the min and 25 for the max. Okay, and now this is gonna change. So the maximum is 25 and the minimum is 0. Okay, all right. We can also make sure that our inputs at the beginning is not empty, because when we start it's empty. So you can just set it to 0 if you want to. So just by selecting the inputs using its ID and just setting its value to 0 at the beginning. So now if we refresh the page, we can see that at the very beginning is 0, and once we start sliding, we can see the value changing. All right. Okay. So that's how we create sliders with single handles. Now we're going to move to sliders with with two handles, which will represent usually a range of values. Okay, so rather than having only one value, we're going to have two handles, and we're going to have a range between the first value and the second value. First value with the first handle and second value with the second handle. Okay. Alright, so we're going to create another div for the second slider. We can just copy paste the first div with the label as well and the input. Okay, so the second slider, we're going to give it an ID range slider. Okay, and so let's say that we're gonna have an input for a range of mileage. So let's say we're having a website where the user can look for a car to buy, and they want to look for a car with a certain mileage between within a certain range. Okay, so our label is going to be mileage, and the input is going to be text, and we're going to give it an ID as well. Let's call it mileage or mileage range. Okay, similar to what we've done with the first slider, we're going to access the slider in the code, and we're going to use the same method. So we'll access the slider using its ID, which is range slider, and we'll use the slider method. All right. This time we have a range slider, so we're going to need a property to tell the browser this is not a single handle slider, but this is a range slider. So the property is range that we need to set to true. Okay, so if we do that, refresh the page, now we can see that we've got two handles there. Okay, and the input that we're expecting, or the inputs here, is giving us a range. Okay, so we've got a range between that value and that value. Okay, okay, so let's set a min and max for our slider as we did before. So let's set the min to 0 miles and the max to 100,000 miles. Okay, we can set the initial value of our slider. So rather than having the range starting at 0 to 0, so we can have a range, an initial range between 0 and 10,000 miles, for example. Okay, so the property is values, and we're gonna set that to a range like that. So we need to use an array. So first value is 0 and the second one 10,000 miles. All right, so let's check. So now we can see that we're starting at a range between 0 and 10,000. Okay, now we're gonna add our slide function as we did before. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna make sure that when we slide the handles, our range is shown inside the input. Okay, so first of all, let's just style our inputs as we did for the first one. So our inputs this time is mileage range. Okay, let's just add it there. Okay, so now we're styling both the slider value and the mileage range. Okay, let's add some margin bottom to the Microsoft div so it looks better. Okay, that's better. Okay, so we're gonna set our slide property. So again, we are going to need a function with the event and UI objects, and let's write the code we need inside our function. So what we're gonna do, so every time we slide, we're gonna access the inputs. Okay, so let's access the inputs using its ID, which is mileage range. Okay, and we're gonna change the value of this input. Okay, so first we're gonna need the first value. Let's just write a sample of how it's gonna look like. So if we know our range, let's say the range is between 0 and 10,000 miles, then it's gonna look like this. So 0 miles space minus sign 10,000 miles. Okay, let's test it first, even if it's a fixed value. Make sure it's working. So once we start sliding, we can see the value there. It looks all right. So now we want the values to change according to the position of the handles. So rather than 0, we need to access the position of the first handle. Okay, so we're gonna break this. Okay, plus 10,000 plus miles. Okay, that looks all right. Okay, and rather than 0 and 10,000, so the first value is going to be UI dot values. Okay, and as we know, the values is an array with two values, so we're accessing the first value, which is the elements of index 0 in our array. So the initial value is values are 0 and 10,000. So we're just accessing values inside the object UI. Okay, and as values is an array, we just need the index of the value that we need. So the first one is the element of index 0. Okay, and then the second one is UI dot values 1. Okay, let's try this and make sure it's working. So if we start sliding, so we can see the second value, and we can see also the first value changing. Okay, so it's a little bit not very good to have the miles going or increasing by 1. Usually, if you go to a website where you look for cars to buy and you want to select the mileage, usually you've got the values increasing by something like 1,000 miles. So we need a property for that. It's called step, and we can set that to 1,000, which means that we are increasing or decreasing by 1,000 every time. Okay, it's a comma. Okay, so now we can see looks better and it's working. All right. At the beginning, we don't have any value there, so we can make sure that we've got our initial value there. So we're just gonna use the same code that we used here outside the slider method. We're just gonna access the values using another way. So the first value, we're gonna access it by first accessing the slider using its ID. Okay, and then we're gonna use the slider method, and then we're gonna have a couple of parameters there. So the first one is which property we're looking at, its values, and the second one is the index, okay, of the array. Okay, so the second value is going to be the same. So rather than using the UI objects, we're using the same code, but this time we're looking at index 1. All right, so let's go for that and make sure it's working. Yes, it is working. So initially, this is the initial value, and once we start sliding, we can see the values changing. Okay, so in the next video, we're gonna look at a little bit more widgets.